University. So I'm delighted that David and I share that in common. David serves as the director of the Prince Mohammed bin Fahd Program for Strategic Research and Studies at UCF. This program is a joint undertaking of the Global Perspectives Office and the College of Sciences at UCF, and it stems from a partnership between UCF and Prince Mohammed bin Fahd University, which is a Saudi university located in Al-Khobar. David is an experienced Middle East specialist. He writes regular columns for both Al-Aram Weekly and Saudi Gazette. He's worked on regional projects in a number of fields, including politics, business, and academia. He also brings background in entrepreneurship, having established numerous firms serving specific needs whose clients, partners, and collaborators include governments, business organizations, and private sector entities. He was a regional advisor for Goddard Global, an international strategic communications firm. He also served as a consultant on foreign policy, energy, and trade for the Livingston Group, one of Washington's prominent bipartisan government relations firm. David received his BA in History, Political Science, and Russian Studies from Indiana, and a Master of Arts degree in Muslim Christian Understanding from Georgetown University. I might add, parenthetically, that David has just returned. He's fresh off a trip to Egypt and Saudi Arabia, so he will focus on developments today as he makes his presentation. Please join me in welcoming our guest speaker, David Dunn.
Thank you very much, Aaron. It's a pleasure to be here. It's, of course, always a tough act after lunch. So hopefully I won't see any of you nodding off, or if you do, that's fine. I won't be offended. I like to always try to look at some optimistic signs. And I grew up a Chicago Cubs fan, so it's been very hard throughout my life to do so. But Ernie Banks is one of my heroes, and this is a guy, if you ever get the chance to meet him, he's always positive at the beginning of the season and through the season, even if the Cubs are 30 games out, which they usually are. It's very easy today when you look at Egypt and you see the reports in the news of doom and gloom and violence and bloodshed and perpetual turmoil. Reality is that, but it's much, much more. What we're seeing today, not just in Egypt, but in the whole Middle East, is really an evolutionary process which has good, bad, and ugly components. But at the end of the day, people are, in Egypt in particular, aren't just acting with violence and lashing out. They're also acting as concerned citizens about their country's future, particularly among the young people. You have 2 years ago, before Hosni Mubarak fell, you would have never imagined what you just saw on July 3rd, which you had 30 million Egyptians sign a signature demanding that the president step down. You had 16 million Egyptians on the streets of Cairo, Alexandria, and every city in Egypt, which resulted in another change. And make no mistake, this was a citizen-led initiative. The military clearly was involved, but these are people expressing their grievances and demonstrating that their will prevail. This is also showing the power of new technology and the ability to communicate. And again, these are youth-driven movements in Egypt in particular. It's pretty fascinating to see, and I think you're going to see over time. For good and for bad, you're going to see Egyptian citizens at least demanding whatever government leads it, that they deliver on certain needs, certain demands, and certain expectations. I think this is all a very good thing. Going back, of course, there's a lot of bad things that have occurred underway, and it's tough to start talking about Egypt and decide what to focus on and what not to focus on. And at any point, I would encourage your questions. I'm going to try to keep it relatively short because I think questions is the best way to address a number of issues. I'll try to touch a little on U.S. policy in the Middle East right now, later, but I thought I'd walk through what's happened here the last couple of years. Hosni Mubarak ruled Egypt for just about 30 years. It's common now to see reports of his despotic regime, the autocracy. However, this is not a guy who was Saddam Hussein. This is a guy who maintained his country, which is not easy to do when you consider Egypt has the highest percentage of government employees in the world right now. It's a bureaucracy that's an 800-pound gorilla that Mubarak, nor President Morsi, nor the Egyptian army can even begin to tackle. It's got a public that is largely poor and growing. Hosni Mubarak in 1983, not long after he became president, was asked by Diane Sawyer, what's Egypt's biggest challenge? And he said, well, the problem is we have 30 million too many Egyptians. The demographic issue is a huge one, and this is played in. It continues to play out both in Egypt and Saudi Arabia, as I was just explaining their population explosion, and all over the region. How do you provide jobs for young people who are getting more educated, more aware of the outside world, and have elevated expectations? Mubarak ran a government that delivered some basics, relied heavily on food subsidies and fuel subsidies to allow the poor to live with a degree of a social safety net. Later, by the way, some of the problems with President Morsi was he proposed to reduce these subsidies, which is necessary given the Egyptian public, but it alienated a lot of poor people. Mubarak led a government and a system in Egypt which has always been centralized. It always is centered around the leader. And around the leader kind of develops a cult of personality. All acts in the business community, in the political community, in the security apparatus were largely to please the master, the ruler, which was Mubarak. When you had problems of corruption, he would occasionally prosecute or urge the prosecution of a major business figure who is obviously had their hands dirty with government contracts and proximity to power. He allowed funding and expanding of universities. The quality suffered, but more people were educated. He served the interests of the United States as well, which is another thing. Part of the Camp David Agreement, of course, in Carter years was a guarantee of military and economic aid to both Israel and Egypt. And the aid to Egypt allowed Egypt to maintain, in many ways, its military with not having that become a major budget issue going forward. It also guaranteed peace and stability to the Middle East, which was a central pillar of American policy up till recent times. Mubarak's biggest problem was a failure to adapt, and the fact that when you have so many decisions that rely on the leader and you get up in years, you're not able to govern as effectively. Mubarak essentially lost interest to govern. You had lots of speculation on who was to rise. Part of the system, when you have a government based on a cult of personality, is any time a figure, a government minister, for example, the General Abu Ghazala, which has been famous in the Charlie Wilson's War book because he was a central player in both our anti-communist efforts as well as collaboration with the U.S. forces during the first Gulf War, became a very popular figure with a lot of charisma, and his career was shortened. And you saw this time and again when you had someone whose stature rose to a certain level, suddenly it would collapse. The media, not necessarily at Mubarak's prodding, but because of this cult of personality, would attack this person that they saw as a rival to the leader. Now, what this created was a lack of a political class in Egypt moving forward. You had a party, the National Democratic Party, and I remember asking the leader of this party, a guy named Yusuf Wali, who went to jail after Mubarak fell, who at the time was the Minister of Irrigation. And I didn't know that the context. This guy was also the party leader, and I kept asking him questions. It was irrigation and fisheries. And I kept trying to ask him questions about fisheries. And he finally said, "Do you know what I really do?" Being poorly briefed is something that unfortunately Americans have fallen into the last couple of years. But I asked him finally, what does the National Democratic Party stand for? He said, well, it stands for the party of the president, which is pretty profound, because you don't have big ideological differences. There were opposition parties which were token, but nothing really legitimate. The opposition, though, during those years, and during the years of Sadat before Mubarak and Nasser before Sadat, was the Muslim Brotherhood, which is a organization, if you try to define it, it will be very difficult. It's part religious, it's part populist political movement, it's part a youth organization, part a business empire. All of these things, and it's always been illegal as well. But what the Brotherhood did was, first of all, they rallied against the British when they were occupying Egypt. Then they rallied against the powers that be at the time, saying Islam is the solution, and we will earn goodwill by symbolic acts. For example, copying textbooks for college students who couldn't afford them. They'd make Xerox copies and hand these out. During Ramadan or religious holidays, they'd bring food to poor people. They'd run healthcare clinics that were more efficient than the government ones. So they built up a degree of credibility, even though a lot of Egyptians did not buy into their central narrative, which is Egypt is an Islamic nation first, and our outlook on history, on what it means to be part of this nation, is a pan-Islamic outlook, which is in stark contrast to Mubarak. Mubarak, General Sisi today, Nasser certainly, and Sadat, which is an Egyptian is an Egyptian is an Egyptian. We're all conservative religiously, whether we're Christians or Muslims. That's fine, but we're Egyptians first. We celebrate certain holidays that are national holidays, not just religious holidays. This difference in narrative and outlook is important in understanding Egypt today. Regardless, so you had some suspicion with the Brotherhood, but you had an organization that had delivered goodwill, and it was cracked down repeatedly, because part of its agenda as well is you have the one hand doing good deeds and having this message. You have the other hand, which has always been called the secret hand, which was involved in political violence and terrorism activities and encouraging other groups that were like-minded fellow travelers, but not necessarily the Brotherhood, to also use terrorist tactics to get political ends. It is the Muslim Brotherhood who did spawn al-Qaeda eventually. Syed Qutb, one of their great philosophers, his book called Signpost, which he wrote when he was imprisoned during the Nasser period for an involvement in an assassination attempt on Nasser, that is the, if you will, and this is of course the wrong terminology, but that is the Bible of al-Qaeda, if you will. That's not to say that all political Islamists are terrorists, but that is part and parcel of the root. And Egyptians were suspicious of this. Regardless, no one anticipated what happened in January 25th, 2 years ago, when you had grievances built up over at the last decade of Mubarak's ruling burst out, partially as they had seen the model work in Tunisia, grievances over no accountability for police violence. And the most notable event was a young man named Khaled Said, who was a blogger, and blogging became irritants among young activists of the regime. This young man was at a coffee shisha shop in Alexandria and was beaten to death in broad daylight. Even in Egypt, where police brutality was condoned or looked the other way or explained one reason or another, this was too much for the system. That happened in autumn In January, things burst out. Tunisia was successful. People were surprised. Young Egyptians started organizing, coming onto the streets. Of course, I said this had been happening over 10 years. You had had labor disputes. You had had increasing unemployment. You had had a number of economic reforms, but were top-down and were seen by most Egyptians as benefiting big businessmen, particularly those around Gamal Mubarak, the president's son, and since no other political figure could rise, the only real successor that people saw in a political sense to Mubarak. Even though if you ask Hosni Mubarak or some of his top advisors, they would insist, and they'd insist to this day, that that scenario would not have played out had he died. I don't necessarily believe that, but they have convinced themselves that that was the case because Egyptians would never allow what happened in Syria, for example. Nonetheless, these are some of the roots of the Mubarak problem. You had after Mubarak fell, it's what's next. The army filled the void because it had to. There was no other element there. The police essentially crumbled in the face of protesters, which they could not manage. Their minister had long tried to position himself as a future president, and his kind of mini cult of personality collapsed. So you had no control on the streets. The military moved in. They also forced Mubarak's hand that his resignation was going to come sooner rather than later. And then it was, what do we do next? And this is essentially where a narrative between what happened inside Egypt as Egyptians saw it and what happened according to how Washington saw things kind of splits drastically. A lot of the moves made, if you had said, you have a military takeover in turmoil, hold 2 credible elections for parliament, another credible election for constitutional change, and then another credible election for president, all monitored by international organizations and Jimmy Carter, and then turned over power to one of their nemesises, the Muslim Brotherhood, you would say that is quite an amazing democratic transition. And the Egyptian military saw themselves in a heroic role. They were criticized heavily, though, by the Western press for you didn't do enough to crack down on police brutality. You did not do enough to look at this election rule was done the wrong way, and you should allow international organizations that were funding political parties to operate. And the Egyptian military was stung by some of this criticism, and it was very easy for me because I actually worked as an advisor for the Egyptian military and had friends in the Obama administration at the same time to say not every mistake that's made is made because there was some conscious decision to manipulate. A lot of these decisions, problems that developed, were made because these are military officers, they're not constitutional scholars. They're not policemen. They're certainly not economists, I assure you. And there's been wild estimations of what the Egyptian military has tried to do and not tried to do. Just as there's been on the Egyptian side every conspiracy theory under the sun about what the United States is doing, partially because of misunderstanding, partially because there's been a failure in Washington to recognize some of their acts, the symbolic importance. For example, if we fund organizations that are NGOs that are dedicated to political development, civil society growth, I think we can all say that sounds like a good thing to do, right? The problem is when you give an organization that has a capacity to spend $1 million a year on specific projects and dump $50 million and say you have to spend this, and we want to have influence on the political parties that are emerging, it creates a real problem. We wouldn't allow Egypt to spend money on parties here, and we didn't quite understand this. Our ambassador, when the presidential election was underway last year, saw that the Muslim Brotherhood was likely to win because it's not about how big they are, it's about how organized an entity is. And you had 80 years of organization. That's ultimately why they won. However, you also have an Egyptian public that's uneasy about these guys. And yet you have the American ambassador meeting their head, repeatedly in public, every congressional delegation going through Egypt, meeting their presidential candidate and not any of the others, which is sending off a signal, which you hear today, that the Obama administration absolutely backed the Muslim Brotherhood. And that's why. Now, if you're United States, you have real national interests here. Egypt is critical for our military operations in Iraq and Afghanistan and throughout the Middle East. International treaties, for example, don't allow nuclear-powered naval ships through the Suez Canal, something the Egyptian government has always ignored. It takes 28 days to get clearance to pass a notice prior to when you pass the Suez Canal for any other ship except the U.S. Navy, which it takes a day and a half. Now, if you think of it, the cost of running an aircraft carrier, and if it had to sit 28 days, not to mention the security involved with getting these ships through, all patrolled by the Egyptian military. It's interesting, because one of the things you've heard a lot about is how much military assistance we give to Egypt. The Egyptians have always said, we'd like you to score, that's a budget term, score the price it would cost if we actually made you abide by normal laws in just the Suez Canal, or didn't allow overflight of military aircraft, which we don't allow for anyone else, which is a lot more. So there's actually a fee-for-service contract, and we get a lot of benefit there. Anyway, back to Morsi. The Muslim Brotherhood and other Islamist parties were organized through mosques and through grassroots networks that were developed over decades. That's what won the election for them. Their base of support was about 24% in both the parliamentary elections and the presidential elections. However, when the system was that you had to have a runoff. The runoff that elected Mohamed Morsi featured Mohamed Morsi against Mubarak's last prime minister, which was, for many Egyptians, well, we don't trust the Brotherhood, but it represents change from the system we just worked to overthrow. Even then, Morsi won by less than 1%. Now, the Brotherhood misinterpreted what their mandate was. They didn't know, for example, the Egyptian military, what motivates it. You read a lot now about the Egyptian military controls so much of the Egyptian economy, 70%, 80%. All these numbers are unfounded, by the way. And they want their perks as they've always been. So the Brotherhood said, we're not going to change anything, any of your operations. And then, because they thought they were being sneaky, we're going to appoint a new defense minister. And Field Marshal Tantawi, head of the armed forces then, you can retire or put up a fight, what are you going to do? Tantawi decided to retire. A new general, General Sisi, was promoted. And the Brotherhood thought, we have our man. He's religiously conservative, his wife is veiled. He must be one of us. They didn't read the man's full CV. He had been in charge of military intelligence. He had done 4 different tours to the United States War College, extremely politically savvy. So they built their relationship with the military on false assumptions. They actually created a much more politicized military that was had a political bone in its body, was motivated by nationalism, not by perks, things they discounted which came to bite them later. They did implement their agenda, their Islamist agenda, in limited form. They didn't do anything drastic immediately, but it was more of a creeping, what legislation is being proposed in Parliament, which, by the way, the judiciary had disqualified the Parliament, saying it was elected in fraudulent grounds, so they ruled outside of the Constitution, which is something that's also missed. Egypt has 2 houses. In short, I don't want to get too much into the weeds, and I know I am. There's a lower house that has legislative authority, and then an upper house which operates like the British House of Lords. Approves legislation but does not propose it. They ran strictly through their upper chamber that had no legislative authority, and they implemented moves that took away some rights of women, of Christians, of a growing number of Egyptian people. On the economic side, a group that was known for symbolic acts made no acts except a very obvious attempt to take the piece of the pie that Mubarak's National Democratic Party controlled, including business related to the state. They also, so they were seen as greedy and not doing anything to address people's woes, and the economy is terrible. And when you have 2 years of protest, by the way, and tourism's your biggest number one economic sector, that's actually not good for business either. So you had increasing economic problems they did nothing to address. When the judiciary said some of the laws they had passed were unconstitutional, Morsi proposed a judicial reform bill that would have immediately resulted in half the judges retiring. And then on the security side, Egypt's lifeblood is the Nile River, always has been since time eternity. The one thing Egypt has always said we'll go to war over is if anyone threatens the integrity of the flow of the Nile. Ethiopia this summer proposed a massive new dam across the Nile River, which threatened in some cases to cut up to 40% of water for a 5-year period going into Egypt, which would have been absolutely devastating. Morsi did not respond to this. The military was appalled. They were actually ready to retaliate if need be, or at least have the contingency plans in effect. They were absolutely appalled by the president's inability to kind of have this issue register as important at all. So you're seeing growing discontent among all segments of society, and the young people who largely backed Morsi in the runoff election, thought at least he's not Mubarak and he's going to move the country forward, of course immediately fell out. Some of these people have become professional protesters in fairness, so they're going to fall out with whoever. But they started organizing a campaign against Morsi, which started very quietly, very modestly. It's the Tamarod campaign, the rebel campaign, signed to, if you want Morsi to resign, essentially. Started slow, and then in a matter of months, this picked up such a steam, and I know this because I met with the military at the time. They were facing a dilemma because the petitions were going to be submitted on June 30th, and they had called all Egyptians to get out and protest on that day. And the military suddenly realized there is political opposition motivated. They were not inclined to act before this, but we are not going to let the will of the Egyptian people be thwarted. And yes, I've got some rose-colored glasses on the military's intention. Of course, they have their own political motivations beyond that, but they are truly nationalist. And they were not going to let the Brotherhood crush the will of the people, and eventually that's how events played out. Now, the Brotherhood's response to this, first of all, is we're democratically elected, which played into a convenient message to the outside world. He did win an election after all. However, he governed unconstitutionally, and that's what ultimately got him. And then it was also they backed themselves into a corner by telling their followers, you have Muhammad and you have Morsi. And we're there. When you get into that position, you get on your own cloud, and you can't tell your supporters to climb down. Then the Brotherhood's leadership was arrested. This is an organization that was very centralized. So you don't have, younger people don't know how to respond, younger activists. You also have a PR shop, which is very smooth. The Brotherhood is slick in this, who casualties actually serve their interest. So these poor demonstrators getting mowed down, eventually in confrontations. This becomes a more powerful talking point to the outside world, which sees a traditional Banana Republic military coup as opposed to a mass movement of people that the military ended up siding with them. There's a lot of flux right now, but you do have a process playing out. I was able, just by fate and circumstance, to work in the last presidential campaign with Amr Moussa, who was a candidate who was leading with a week left and ended up in 5th. I'd like to think it wasn't because of me. But he's actually leading the committee that's finishing the Constitution within the next week. The Egyptian people will vote on this Constitution, then they'll have parliamentary elections, then presidential elections. Now, you can't expect a Western-style democracy. You can't expect a lot of things, but if you're looking at this as an American, first of all, you got to realize there's a lot of things you don't know, And sometimes the most wise path is to shut your mouth. This is an Egyptian event, and it's playing out inside Egypt. We have national security interests at stake in our relationship with Egypt. And we have to focus on those. Yes, if you can help Egypt in some ways, if you want to show goodwill, you've got to think how you can do that in a non-political way. Conditioning aid based on political developments in a country that's experienced colonialism often backfires. There's a lot of mistakes along the road. The Egyptian path is not going to be smooth, but I started by saying, I wouldn't want to say what Ernie Banks says and let's play two. Let's just do this once with Egypt, but I do think they're on the right path. This is an evolutionary process. We've had our ups and downs in this country, but I think people's civic involvement is moving right now. It's moving to watch. People have expectations and hope, and that's a good thing. So I think I'm going to open it up for questions and go from there. Yeah, I can hear you. Well, the Salafis are even further to the right of the Brotherhood on the Islamist scale. But, and in the past, they have blood on their hands. From the 90s, they actually were not political parties. They were terrorist organizations that fought the Egyptian state and did such acts as kill politicians and the Luxor massacre. They swore off violence about 10 years ago, organized political parties. They joined the revolutionaries to overthrow the Brotherhood. Now, they did this. I don't believe they did this because they want a secular, inclusive Egypt. I think they did this out of political shrewdness. If the Brotherhood is gone, someone's going to get the Islamist-oriented votes, and they did that for that reason. But the military and others who are stakeholders in the Egyptian political process now will say, if they're willing to play ball on the Constitution, there's no reason we can't compromise with them on some things and actually help dilute some of the poison the Brotherhood's spewing out. Because I didn't mention the Brotherhood's reaction to Morsi falling was to encourage incitement against Christians, attacks on police stations, and particularly terrorism in the Sinai Peninsula. So anyway.
If the military has a very strong economic and political interest in the operation of Egypt, why should the West ever believe that Egypt will be anything other than a military dictatorship?
Well, I actually don't think economics plays a great deal into the Egyptian military's thinking. And when I said 70 or 80%, I said those because when you see those statistics, there's never a citation. This is a gross overestimation. The Egyptian military does have about 400,000 soldiers. They do produce their own bread, their own food. They also sell some appliances and things like that, partially to cover their own budget costs. It isn't for a business enterprise. I think the bigger problem on having a military continuation, it's likely Sisi's going to run for president, and I'll explain why. His inclinations was, I do not want to become a political candidate, and I do believe those are sincere. I've met with the man several times. However, once you remove Morsi, who is going to lead this country? And he's being told by everyone around him and people organizing petition drives to have him run for president. You're the man. So that comes into your brain, but also if you're Sisi and you look around and say, geez, the legacy of the Mubarak regime is there are no other capable political leaders right now. Who do we entrust our country's leadership to? I think that's kind of the bigger problem.
Yes, I had a question. First, I wanted to thank you very much for a very interesting review of a topic on a very important ally of this country. It seems, though, that we never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. Even though our leverage in Egypt now is at an all-time low, I would think. After all, we threw Mubarak under the bus. A strong leader who we have lots of differences with, but someone who also always supported our interests. And we couldn't wait to have Mohamed Morsi come to the White House and visit with the president. How much leverage do we have left now, now that we're even cutting back our support on the military and holding off on a lot of the promises that we made to them about delivering military equipment? I'm concerned about, in particular, something we don't hear much about, and that is I've heard numbers anywhere between 50 and 80 churches have been burned to the ground in Egypt, and Christians have been attacked on the streets. And if we're so worried about promoting democracy and our values around the world, why don't we say something about that?
Well, I agree, and some of this is being misreported in terms of as if there's some kind of Egyptian army complicity in these attacks on Christian churches. If you talk to any Coptic Egyptian, and I remember talking to a good friend of mine who is an Egyptian reporter. He does happen to be Coptic, and this guy's done fellowships at Brookings, so he's not an uninformed person. And I said, Isaac, what do you think? 99% of Egyptian Christians are fervent supporters of Sisi and the Egyptian military. And he said, I think 100%. I've never encountered one that isn't. Why is that message lost somehow? Or else there's actually been letters from senators criticizing the Egyptian government right now for its treatment of Christians. And the Egyptians are like, are you kidding me? This is, we did this because these attacks. This is actually brotherhood-driven incitement against Christian churches. That's a very real thing. In terms of the Egyptian military and leverage, this is not just about what equipment they buy from us. And by the way, this is money that's Egyptian aid, but it goes to U.S. defense firms, every dime. So this is a subsidy for our own firms. That's one aspect. Part of our rationale was we don't want to deliver systems that aren't needed except in anti-terrorism operations. Well, in Sinai, they're using Apache helicopters. Those are delayed. Beyond that, though, Egyptian military will say it's not just assistance in terms of military hardware, it's our whole orientation. We are trained by the U.S. military in many ways. Our posture is Western-based, and our whole national security outlook is premised on our peace treaty with Israel, our alliance with the United States, and our interest in actually minimizing regional conflicts. And on those things, they're still solid. And they don't want to change, by the way. This week's flirtation with Russia. This is going to be reported as a big thing. They want to send a message. They do have cards to play here if the U.S. keeps ignoring them. I mean, we announced a new national Middle East policy and did not consult the Saudis or Egyptians on it at all, which is why Secretary Kerry last week went to Riyadh and Cairo essentially to apologize. This was a huge mistake, and that was an opportunity missed. I do think it's repairable, though, even though there's a lot of feeling that we've been taken for granted by Washington, quite honestly, among them. And they've made mistakes, too. I don't want to just blast our policy. There's still an opportunity to repair things. So,
David, also there is, I want everybody to know, a Coptic Christian church locally in Maitland. My question is, knowing that tourism is extremely important to Egypt, what is the situation now for any of us who may want to travel to Egypt?
I can refer you, I know that the Minister of Tourism, and me saying it's not that bad probably isn't the promotional campaign he wants. But in all fairness, I've been in and out of Egypt almost every month, and I've never felt uncomfortable. Unless you're in a square that there's a demonstration going on, which I wouldn't recommend to anyone, Egyptian or American, to walk through, it's generally business as usual, more or less, except there's a lot less tourists. Egyptians are dying to have tourists. They rely on hospitality. They rely on this. So you're their life's, you're their income, from the guy selling postage stamps to the guy owning the hotel. So you'd be actually treated very well right now. I went to Egypt right after 9/11, and there was no one there. And you had Egyptians saying thank you to me for coming. I mean, it's moving. It's moving. Terrorism is a terrible thing for them, because tourism is their number one business and industry.
As you were connected to the Obama administration also, in addition to Egypt,
Is that an accusation or a statement of fact?
it's going to be a question. As it was mentioned, we very easily threw Mubarak, who was our dictator, under the bus. And then we have denied all the promised military supplies to Egypt. After this happened with Morsi, we sent 2 senators over there to try to save Morsi. And we tried everything to keep the Islamists in power or coming back to power. And now, of course, now they are talking to the Russians, and they were always talking to the Saudis, who have them with much more money than we ever gave them. What is going on with this administration foreign policy?
Boy, I think that'll be my next discussion here. I mean, a lot of this is, some of this has been coming for a long time. And I guarantee you, if you ask President Obama or any of his advisors, they didn't want to deal with the Arab Spring on their watch, when you're already involved in how you end Iraq war and Afghanistan war. How do you change all these other things? I think the mistakes so you have a lot of changing dynamics, which was going to be difficult for the U.S. to maneuver under the best of circumstances. What I think they need to work on better is the mistakes that are avoidable, not the things that are unavoidable. You can't help. Mubarak was going to go. We shouldn't have thrown him under the bus, yes, but he was going to go. You have to adapt. Some of the reasons you embraced Morsi is we want to keep our interests. It wasn't because we liked Morsi necessarily. I can understand that mistake, but how is that going to play in the public? How secure is this guy politically? Like I said, when you're announcing a regional policy, like Susan Rice did 2 weeks ago in a New York Times interview, you have not consulted your key Arab allies in Saudi Arabia and Egypt, not one time. They read about it in the New York Times too. That's an avoidable mistake, and a huge one. And even worse, the U.S.'s priorities are going to be Iran, Syria, and Palestine. Egypt wasn't mentioned, nor was Saudi Arabia, and they're thinking, where are we now?
I have the mic, David, and thank you for an extremely interesting update on the Egyptian crisis, which of course affects all of the Mideast, all of Arabia. Yesterday, the BBC announced that top officials in Egypt have hailed talks with Russian ministers in Cairo as historic. And the article further says that in addition to the Egyptians courting the Russian ministers, this follows the United States decision to cut defense aid to Egypt in response to the ousting of President Mohamed Morsi. Excuse me. Now, you've touched on these things, but I would like you to flesh this out a little bit more. I was very concerned to read that the Russians are willing to be courted by the Egyptians.
Well, first of all, it's the other way around in many cases. The Russians have almost begged Egypt to take brand new MiGs fighter jets for the last decade. Please take them. This is in their business interests. They're trying to get more influence in the region right now. They're feeling that they have new muscles after the Cold War. Now they have an oil supply going. They have some wealth, and they're trying to reposition themselves. In Egypt, it would be a huge win for them if they were able to get any leverage in Cairo. Now, the Egyptians are using the Russians, quite honestly. If your girlfriend is flirting with another guy, you're going to get mad. And Egypt being the girlfriend in this case, they've felt ignored, so they're talking to someone else to get the attention of the United States. Now, it's not unprecedented. Iraq, showed their gratitude for us liberating them from Saddam Hussein by signing the biggest defense contract with Russia last year. And yet they still have the gall to come 2 weeks ago to the White House and ask for more assistance from the U.S. Turkey, angry with us for a number of things, just bought a new weapon system from China, new missile system, when they've almost always bought U.S. equipment. They do this to get attention as well as to make purchases. And the reality on the military side is Egypt's military used to all be Russian. And after 2 decades, this dates back to the Nasser time, they were a Cold War pawn. They were the Soviets' client. Israel was our client. And our weapons systems fought each other repeatedly. Sadat's break was he went to us and went away from Russia. That's history. But the fact of the matter is 40% of their military hardware is still of Russian origin, and they periodically buy upgrades. All their air defense systems are Russian. That's what they're buying, and you're going to read next week a massive new Egyptian military purchase. It isn't new, but it's going to be billed at that, both because the Egyptians want to get attention of Washington, and Washington's paranoid about the Russians replacing them in influence.
Just a quick comment. I was in Egypt during Desert Storm, and there were no American or European tourists there. It was fantastic. No lines anywhere. You could get in all the tombs within like 5 minutes. But I wanted to go back in time a little bit to, is it Said who wrote Signposts?
Yes.
Now, can you...
Syed Qutb, that's what I was talking
Syed
about earlier.
Qutb. Didn't he visit the United States?
He did. He was actually, he went to the University of Denver for a
And wrote
semester.
a scathing
Yes.
critique.
We're not for everyone, apparently. Yeah.
Well, now that's what Al-Qaeda used as their
Yes.
kernel of philosophy. Can you just expand upon that a little bit and tell us about it? Because probably many of us don't know what's actually in that treatise or book.
Well, I mean, it's a lot of things at once. It's very puritanical reading of one's religion, and using it changes the idea of jihad, which we've heard a lot, that term. Jihad can mean a personal struggle. My jihad of getting up and getting to work on time every day. Literally, that is a use. If you use the jihad as a struggle against oppressors, which justify violence, that's what Qutb was focusing on. And it also had an anti-imperialist message, and again, Egypt was fresh off the British involvement there and the French involvement before that. And it also incorporated what Qutb saw as decadence of Western society. Dancing and TV and women wearing skirts, things that he abhorred. So he kind of wrote it up into a manifesto that was able to resonate with some people.
Like many people in the room,
Excuse me.
Oh, excuse me.
Nasser executed him for it, by the way. So, yeah.
I've traveled all over the world. I felt so very safe in Egypt 2.5 years ago, just a little before the coup, but we were given a bodyguard. And I was so surprised. We were going to be going from Cairo to Alexandria. And the president of the tour group, which we were there with Charlotte Dutton, that wanted to start a travel agency from Orlando direct, so we were kind of given the VIP treatment. I said I didn't know my body needed to be guarded, and he explained that it was so important that American tourists feel very safe. And I did. There at that time were 2 military on each street corner that were armed, but at no time during the month we were there did I feel anything except I just wanted to go home and plan another trip to go back. So I was so pleased when you mentioned that. Have you been afforded a bodyguard when you're there?
And I wouldn't want one because it actually would make me stand out more.
Right.
And there are Egyptians of all shades, of all religions. This is a country that since the Pharaoh's days have had different nationalities in and out of it. It's the center of the world, and you rely on the tourist trade. So I don't stand out at all. So I never feel like I need one. When I've had them, I felt uncomfortable. I used to facilitate trips for members of Congress to go over. Then I worked for Congress for 10 years before, and I remember as a congressional staffer, myself and another staffer were walking to a bar at night, having some beers, and there was a van following us full of security guards. And I stopped and I was like, "Do you guys really have to follow us? Is it really dangerous?" They said, "Well, you see, there are a lot of Egyptian guards, and we don't have much to do."
Would you comment on Obama throwing Bosnia under the bus? What was he supposed to do? Go to war against the Egyptian military?
No, I mean, the Saudis certainly would characterize it as throwing him under the bus. And yeah, well, it was going to happen sooner or later. I think, so again, when I said sometimes silence is better, we weren't going to fool any Egyptians that Mubarak wasn't our guy at that point. We'd backed him for 30 years, and he'd backed us. So sometimes it's better to say we hope for an orderly transition, full stop. And I think that's a mistake.
Isn't it true that the State Department has considerable sympathy for the Muslim Brotherhood? In fact, there are people there that are very strongly affiliated with the Brotherhood to the extent, so when we supported the elected president of Egypt, it wasn't just because he was the elected president, but because he happened to be from the Brotherhood.
I don't think that's true. I think that's a narrative that's taken up for a number of reasons, but one of them is, one of the problems, you've seen a shift in how the Washington establishment looks at foreign policy. You had a school called Realists, which included people like Zbigniew Brzezinski on the Democratic side or James Baker on the Republican side, who more or less had differences in minor points, not in the grand strategy. You now have a school that is actually very influential, or has been until the last couple months, where you had neoconservatives on the Republican side and you had what's called liberal interventionists on the Democratic side. And one of their central tenets is supporting democratic elections as a ways to end things. So they saw, right or wrong, Mohamed Morsi was elected by the people, and inherently democracy is going to bring moderation. Now, I don't think that works in a Middle Eastern context necessarily unless it comes organically. I think that's a mistake. The other thing is there's a theory, too, among some in the State Department, although I would say John Kerry is a very much in the realist camp, okay? And he wants to maintain relations with Egypt. He did not support cutting aid. And his view will play out and work. Susan Rice almost mimicked him last night in a speech in Washington. And she's been more in the liberal interventionist camp. That's neither here nor there. But there are some who say the best way, who cares about what happens to the Egyptians? But the best way to limit the appeal of militant Islam is by having these guys in a democratic process where they have to pick up garbage and coordinate different government functions. And that, I don't necessarily agree with as it plays out, but I understand the logic perfectly. And I think if you look at those impulses and why they backed Morsi for those reasons, that explains it a lot more than any actual preference for the Brotherhood.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's thank David Dumke for his wonderful presentation.